So going right back to history, it's in the skyline. You can see sort of volcanic plugs there, just two rounded domes, bigger ones here. It was about 40 million years ago. There's 65 volcanic plugs erupted. That's what gave the basalt lava. That overlaid the older granite. And so, Aboriginal history in the Monero, and I'm good mates with the senior lawman of Ngarigo, which this was his clan country here. He lives down there.
Just also observe that Sam is with us. You know Sam?
No, we haven't met, but I'm Ewan anyway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have family that
Good stuff.
Here, yeah.
Okay, well this is sort of, you probably know Ngarigo country, you and we're down the coast more. And from what we know from Josephine Flood and the others, 23,000 years or so, probably Aboriginal settlement of this country. Down the, Rod Mason is the senior lawman, that's a good friend of ours. They've got cultural memory of hunting diprotodons. Down the lower Snowy, they used to ambush them, which is a fairly good memory. And so, don't know whether they are this part of the Monero that early, but certainly we've found Aboriginal axes, and I've brought Rob Mason, who's a good mate now, the senior law guy, and that second hill over there, it's a definite camp, and there's some sacred ceremonial site on it. So he was big in mud when he found some of that sort of stuff. So you know, you can come here whenever he likes to get resource and all that sort of stuff. Sort of an embarrassing situation when you're on Ngarigo country and they don't own it. But anyway, just trying to get the sequence right. So Day, as you probably know, from Josephine Flood and other researchers, lived through the winter down on the coast, and then came up here, not just for the Bogong moths. The whole Monero was a wonderful resource. There used to be plains bustards and curlews and a whole range of critters that have disappeared now. The last bustard was seen at the 1880s, I think. The last curlew my father heard here in about 1930. If you see that big lake out there with the red weed on it, that's actually a sacred lake for the Ngarigo people, which is what Rod's people are. Typical white settlement is called Buckley's Lake, named after a guy called Buckley. It's also well known because it's hardly ever got water in it, but anyway, that's another point. Used to have a lot of water in it. Their name for it, Ngarigo name, is Bundawindiri, and it's actually a sacred lake. When children are born, their spirits come down, and interestingly, an upside down calitris tree. And when people die, their goods people are thrown onto the lake. So I spent a fair bit of time with Rod. He's a senior lawman with his people. And so they would come up in about September, October, harvesting different foods, camping near the water. And then in November, they had a big ceremony of Kalkai and Jindabyne, and then they would go in the mountains for the moth feast. It's quite strongly regulated. And Rod said our people would arrive pretty skinny, come out of the mountains fat with all the moths and stuff. We found artefacts here. So then the Monero settled about 1820s, and it's pretty well repressed. There's a lot of massacres, not so much massive big size, but Rod's taken me to one or two, and those other sites, 15s, 20s, 25s, killed by the white settlers. Remnants in the 1850s put onto a concentration camp in Delicate, and then shipped down the coast and then into Sydney. But thankfully people like Rod have come back, and his great-grandparents were, if you like, for want of a better word, the senior lawmen, the chiefs of the Ngarigo people. So he's got all that knowledge. We found a few axes, like I said. know about the moth feast, which was the big attraction, bogong moths. Which I'm not sure, have they arrived this summer, or is it going to be the third summer that they're not coming, the moths? I haven't heard. Hasn't there? It's an ecological tragedy for the mountains. Yeah, anyway, you'll hear about that on the trip. So, white settlement began, and it was ruthless. Smallpox was brought up on blankets, strychnine, shooting. Rod Mason's got stories of that, and then the remnants were sent to that concentration camp and then out. So it's pretty much, you will not find an indigenous Ngarigo person at Monero. But luckily, people like Rod, who is the senior lawman, is preserving that. He's one of the senior top 12 or 14 elders in the country. Occasionally, all the senior guys will meet up in the Cape or something.
There's a lot of work with fire.
Yeah, we run an annual burning workshop here on Patchburn. He's a good teacher too. And he's mentoring a lot, both you and Ngarigo down the coast. So then the white settlers came in. So between here and the basalt below the houses, as I said, was all grassy woodland. That was all cleared eventually. Before modern fencing, the sheep would have ranged pretty freely with shepherds. We've got a few shepherds' huts on the place. Wire fencing came in about the 1880s, and that was a negative for the landscape because the animals were just kept in situ, which happens today in a lot of the landscape. So your valuable, what are called carbon fours, C4 grasses and others, were chewed out and disappeared, your kangaroo grasses and stuff. We've got it coming back now, but it's your most advanced carbon 4 summer active grass, and that went very quickly because it's so palatable. I'm just trying to get the sequence right for you. So most of the, well, there's a guy called Ryrie, a surveyor in the 30s and 40s, was doing work, and he said, this is before the landscapes had been drained by erosion creeks, which happened after the overgrazing. So wherever you see a creek, an incised gully, that was never there before. It was either soft gullies or chains of ponds. Overgrazing by sheep, clearing of the trees, when you see an incised gully, that's unnatural, it was never here before. So this surveyor Ryrie, about the 1830s, was here for 6 or 7 months, and he said only half the days could they get out surveying with a theodolite because the mists and fogs were that thick until after lunch. You don't get many anymore because the landscape's been dried out, etc., etc. Especially when you clear the grassy woodlands from here onwards down, and you take out those deep absorbent soils and all that exchange of moisture that occurs at night on dew point and all that sort of stuff. So with the white invaders went curlews, plains bustards, all those sorts of guys. Quolls. Seen the odd quoll, but they're in traps that we put out with some wildlife people, but they don't usually live even in this area here, they'll stay on the bigger areas. So when fencing came, the country was belted even more. Rabbits didn't arrive on the Monero until just after the turn of the century, and that's where a huge escalation and devastation occurred. From the 1860s on, most of these bigger places on the Monero took up mountain leases. So after they'd stuffed a lot of the grazing country here, they overgrazed the Monero bogs, and we lost a lot of the sphagnum bogs. And you know, I've got records from previous research of sheep coming from Deniliquin, 30,000 from Wanganella station, all the way to the mountains to graze near Talbingo. So they came from everywhere. The mountains were overgrazed, and a lot of those sphagnum bogs disappeared. Have you been up the hills there? Where you'll see big gullies was once acres of spongy bogs holding tens of thousands of tonnes of water that was reticulated out. They're all gone now. You've got a scour basin. So you've got a dysfunctional hydrology up there because the sheep just honed in on the sphagnum and the sedges and all that sort of thing. You'll hear all that tomorrow, I'm sure. But for the graziers, come November, you could lighten your stocking here, send them up the mountains, let this country come, do damage up there probably, and then they'd come back late in the autumn. And those leases finish with the Kosciuszko National Park in the 60s, so you'll hear about that too. Just trying to get the sequence for you. In the 30s, pasture improvement got going on the Monero. By this time, all the grassy woodland, a lot of the Monero disappeared. I mean, much what you can see, especially out towards those wind towers, is treeless basalt. And which way did you go to Dalgety? Berridale.
We came to Dalgety. We
Right.
went up straight up to Joe and Ted's, and then come back down.
Okay, you didn't come out the Babundra Road.
No.
No. Anyway, a lot of that treeless country over here is actually treeless basalt, but much else of the Monero around Berridale and everywhere else where it's been cleared of grassy woodland. So it's lost a lot of its function. It's pest control, wasps and all those sorts of guys. By the 1950s, post-war, a lot more pasture improvement got going. So the plough started to do a lot of damage, destroying the soil ecology, overgrazing, compaction. So we've slowly, through regenerative grazing, trying to get our native grasses back, and got some really nice patches of orange kangaroo grass now. So the dominant, what's called carbon 4 grass, would have been your Demeter australis, kangaroo grass. If we looked out, if this was 1820, that landscape would be orange, all kangaroo grass, except where the woodland is. It's all gone pretty well, and now we've got lower successional native corkscrew here, or where people have put in pasture improvement. So it's been a huge ecological modification of this grassland, or where there should have been thick woodland here and grassy woodland there. So it's very modified. And we've been about 65,000 plus native trees and shrubs off local seed. Some of it I've collected. It's just trying to get some function back. We can't replant everything, but at least we can have tree breaks, patches, mosaics. So you've got parasitic wasps and other critters, birds, at least feel secure in refugia, and they can cross the space to cover most of it. We can't go back to where it was 1820 for practical reasons. And then pasture improvement on the Monero, as in aggressive ploughing, putting in exotic species, really ramped up from the 50s on. Once the rabbits, myxomatosis wiped the rabbits out, which arrived in about 1902 here, and did the next level of massive land degradation. Not just grasses, but anything regenerating. Even in our basalt country, you can see massive hollows where they dug out the warrens and stuff. My father, who came here in the 20s, said it was nothing to go down with coils of netting, rig them up in the corner, and then herd 1,500 rabbits in by lunchtime and just club them to death. The place was crawling, and that's where a lot of ecological devastation occurred. Because this country would have been shepherded until 1850s and 60s, and then wire fencing came in the 70s. And most of the big places had leases up the mountains. We had a lease just north of Cayandra, which relieved the pressure here, but didn't do much for the ecology up there. And then, to modern times, we've done the flip here. I had to take over this place when I was about 22. I was at ANU, just finishing human ecology, and my father had a heart attack, so I came back, knew nothing about management, and so I copied the best managers, which meant we weren't regenerative or ecological. We were putting in pasture, and I did a fair bit of damage. Eventually woke up after some big droughts, and we're slowly through modern regenerative grazing, holistic grazing, getting our ecology back. So this year there's been an explosion in kangaroo grass and those sorts of things. More resilience in our landscape, we're finding more species appearing. So that's a covers most of it, I think, doesn't it? It's a rapid cooks too.
I think you will invite the students to speak, but you might talk a little bit about some of the principles of regenerative agriculture, not just for yourself, but as would you call it a movement in modern farming?
Worldwide movement, which is accelerating. So the component that we follow, other than trying to plant and get back in diverse native species for a bit of function, parasitic wasps and all those sort of guys, the regenerative or holistic grazing began in Zimbabwe in the 60s with a wildlife biologist called Alan Savory, who after he was instructed to shoot 20,000 elephants because they were trampling everything, and realised now he's still alive, your friend, he realises it's the biggest mistake he made. But he started to ponder how come when you've got millions of animals in these giant African herds, they're the healthiest grasslands you'd ever see. And he realised it was high animal density, a lot of dung and urine, trampling that broke up soil, but they were always moving, driven by the big predators, the big cats. And then those grasslands with all those inputs of urine and dung and a bit of disturbance would have a big period, maybe months, 6 months, to recover before they came back on the return migration. Anyway, cut a long story short, working with agronomists, and he was a wildlife scientist, they developed a method of modern grazing, which is a growing worldwide movement, which we practice, where you replicate the density of those animals, and the humans are moving them, not the big cats or anything, but it has the same stimulatory effect on your ecology. Rapid graze, because your really valuable grasses like your kangaroo grass are called carbon 4 C4 grasses. They're broader leaved, really palatable. If you leave sheep or cattle in for too long, the minute once they get grazed, the sheep and cattle will graze the most valuable C4s. And as soon as they put a few leaves back up, the sheep come and grab them again, and eventually they run out of energy and they die very quickly. So regenerative or holistic grazing is all about, if you like, replicating that animal herd effect. So high numbers, much bigger than most people are used to, very short stays, 1 or 2 days, and then move them on. They don't come back for at least 90, 120 days. And we're now starting to find, by replicating with the dung and the urine and a bit of trampling and that long rest, we're now getting kangaroo grasses and stuff starting to return. And that's a worldwide movement, came out of Africa, America and Australia are some of the leaders. And well, I know there's at least 15,000 Australian farmers out of 100 that have done the courses, 15 to 20,000, maybe half have adopted them, but it's accelerating now. You know, places up to 1 million acres in the territory I visited with cattle, and every region in Australia. It works in your really brittle, semi-arid, arid environments down to your safe, non-brittle, high rainfall areas. It's a really exciting development, and basically you're by stimulating or replicating not just the African herd thing, but a lot of our grasses here, believe it or not, are very similar, if not almost the same as the African grasses. I think the lighter seeds crossed over in the westerlies, things like kangaroo grass. South Africa's got the same. And by replicating that African herd thing in Australia, we're getting remarkable responses in every environment with that rest recovery thing. And then a lot of the innovation in cropping in Australia now uses animals as well. So you use the animals to lay down cover rather than having bare ground, which kills your microorganisms and dries it out. And then you drill through that. So America, Australia, South America and Africa, there's some really exciting stuff. I would guess, it's hard to guess, but the takeoff and uptake of regen ag, I don't know if you guys looked at the innovation adoption curve, but you've got your inventors and your early adopters, which is about 8-12%. Well, I think we've now got into what's called the early majority. it's really taken off. There's some exciting stuff happening in Australia. Grazing, cropping, shrubs, the whole spectrum. Exciting field for the benefit of the landscape.
You said that the kangaroo grass is considered valuable now. Why do you think when the early grazers were coming through and the settlers were coming through, they would see those native grasses as not valuable and want to churn it up, or were they just overgrazed to the point where they couldn't thrive?
Overgrazed, because they're so palatable. They kept on getting re-chewed. Once animals were left in place and they ran out of energy. So the most valuable went first.
Yeah. And that created space for the others too.
Yeah. So we're about to do, through a friend of mine, Bruce Pascoe, about to do work with some of the Yuin women down at Eden. We've got tree breaks, there's plenty of space in them, and they're going to be planting yam daisies and things like that here.
Yeah,
Great collaboration, I think.
Bruce's family for us as well. I was down at Malakuta at his farm, right down 2 weeks ago. It's exciting.
He's doing good stuff, and the director he's got for their new company is a really switched on international business person who wants to change things. So.
That kind of leads into my question. Like, how do you see regenerative agriculture working in an economic sense? Like, now that more and more people are doing it, do you think that's partly because they're realising that it makes economic sense?
Yeah. When it's well applied, and that's why it's growing, it's a lot more profitable. So I write about it in my book. Friends of mine, extraordinary pioneers. I'll give you just this example in Western Australia. Ian and Di Haggerty. They started farming with, he drove triples from Perth to Darwin for 3-4 years to build up some capital, and she worked as an occupational therapist, and they got money for their first farm, which was only 1,000. And they realised they were going broke out. They were northeast of Perth, marginal country. Anyway, they're really innovative thinkers, and so they've evolved natural intelligence agriculture. So they've now gone from a debt on 1,000 acres, they've got 50,000 acres debt free because it's so successful. So what they've done is, huge machines. That all they do is adapt the modern machinery. And I'll come to the biodiversity aspect in a minute. So what he's done is kicked out your Roundup sprays and your industrial chemicals, and they use compost extracts and things like worm juice. They inject them together, put them together just when they're sowing the seed. So they've eliminated over 90% of their costs, all the heavy chemical and fertilisers. And so they've now grown from debt on 1,000 to debt free on 50,000. And the response is so that they try and keep the ground covered. So we're using the big machinery. They keep buying up neighbours who are going broke traditionally. They've got mallee, fowl, plains bustards. They've got about 10,000 acres reserved now for that sort of stuff. And it's pretty exciting stuff. And then there's other guys using different methods, but a similar principle that you can farm without having to nuke the place and create bare ground, because bare ground means dead wild in the Australian heat.
So they're grazing the W, but then they're just keeping the ground cover up with the right.
Colin Sys's pasture cropping. You use the animals to lay down your cover and pull them out.
Sorry, by that you mean, what does lay down your cover?
If you put in the density that holistic grazing requires, if you really up it, you can lay down a thatched cover that protects the soil.
Right, and so that is that like this material that's already here growing, and then it's a way that it starts decomposing it and covering the ground.
Right. And then come the autumn, they will drill through that. And a friend of mine who worked with in the States, a guy called Gabe Brown, pioneered extraordinary stuff up in the North Dakotas. I mean, it's easier there because they've got snow, and so they've got a guaranteed spring. But same sort of principles. What's called multi-species cover cropping. And so you plant without getting technical, but what agronomy scientists discovered, which just happens in a native grassland, if you have minimum 12, 14, 15 species, hopefully across the 5 plant families, all doing different things, you get to a situation where, and it's called quorum sensing, you get a takeoff point, and you've got your soil bugs and the plant starting to communicate. So a plant will say, I'm running out of nitrogen, and the rhizobia bacteria say, okay, no, come in. You get this sort of self-organising takeoff when you get to critical mass with a number of species. So what these croppers in Australia are now doing is upping the species and keeping the ground cover and getting this takeoff effect. Colin Sias is a guy who developed pasture cropping up near Golgong. I took students from, when I was taught a course at ANU up there. And almost by accident he realised that the natives plants were coming back. And so it's some exciting stuff, people thinking outside the square but working with nature, not trying to simplify it.
Has much changed for you since you wrote the book?
As much
Change
change.
for you, or
Well, my life's not as simple.
Your life isn't.
Yeah, no, I'm still, I did a Zoom today to 200 scientists and a lot of travelling and all that sort of stuff, but that's good. Yeah, learn a lot too.
Like, have people or other farmers, traditional farmers, approached you, and has it changed things for them? Or?
Yeah, some, and there's a lot of people who are the real pioneers. I'm more the storyteller, but this district, not much. This is a very, very conservative district. Other districts, really high adoption rates, probably more suited to, this is what we call quite brittle environment. You get 6 months of winter, not much growth. You can have extended droughts. Doesn't mean the principles on grazing apply here as well as anywhere, but for some reason it's sociologically very conservative. So the adoption rates in other districts are pretty exciting. Yeah. This I was on a station a few years ago, 1 million acres, Barclay tablelands, all holistic grazing now, just transformative. Stuff happening everywhere now, in every environment.
Do you find it frustrating, sort of being at the leading edge, or as you say, learning from the innovators and knowing that there's the capacity to change or renew this landscape, and you've got these people around you that aren't really willing to come to the table?
No, look, I can understand. It's all about paradigm. And when I went back, and Rob was one of my supervisors, did a PhD in the late 50s in human ecology. I interviewed 80 regen farmers, an hour and a half interviews with each of them, and and this correlates with research in America in a totally different field, in about 60% of the cases, to crack that paradigm that we all grow up with, took a shock to crack, if you like, to crack open the eggshell. Marriage breakup, poisoned with chemical, big drought, whatever. But some districts and some people are a lot more ready than others. So out of those 80 farmers, about 60% had a big shock, and the others had little shocks. They were already biophilic or nature loving. It's a really interesting field. So this guy sort of kicked me up the bum a bit when I was doing that PhD. It was a good time.
Before you were saying it's impractical to sort of like revegetate or like restore into a level kind of like what you think it might have been like before. Like, what are those barriers making it impractical? Is it like cost? Yeah.
You got a fence. You've got to buy the tube stock. I mean, I used to try and grow it, but you get so busy and you've only got to miss it.
Not much like a native seed bank left anymore.
No, not much. I mean, we're finding the odd thing pop up. See where we're standing here.
Yeah.
A lot of Australia's landscapes, water recharge occurs on the ridges.
Yeah.
So what we did was clear them, then the stock camped there. You had this hard pan of compacted ground. All the water pisses on. gullies. It's sort of madness. It's just not understanding landscape function. So we're slowly getting our ridges. You can't see it over here. We did a job with Greening Australia the other day. Another 1,000 onto a ridge line there, and we're all focusing on the ridge lines. And we'll do this one day too, but dollars and time. At least, we've got good stuff happening over the back.
Do you see much like kind of regrowth coming out of the kind of fringes of that? Like, are there many like saplings on like the borders kind of creeping? Like,
used to. We've now got an issue. We join a national park up here. We don't have the funds and don't manage. So we're overrun with kangaroos. I mean overrun. We do a bit of culling, but you can't cull your way through that and keep bleeding with them. The directors at Kosciuszko National Park, this is part of their offset. But they plead no funds, so we'll have to think of an exclusion fence. I don't want to do that.
so it's cosy in terms of like the management.
Yeah, it's a distinct little Woolway National Park, but it comes under the Kosciuszko National Park.
They don't have money. That's concerning because they're probably in terms of a national park with money.
Go for a walk in there. Go for a walk in the park. You'll see plenty of issues that need addressing, and they haven't got the dough to do it. It's not just ineptitude. Very rarely. It's not an issue. But the closer you are to the parks, it's quite an issue. If it was cattle country, I mean, trying to think of I did a gig with him once, husband and wife who own Woolleen Station. I mean, the kangaroos, but that's cattle country.
Yeah.
If you got sheep, forget it. Yeah. It does work because it looks like that alpha predator, given we haven't got thylacines and stuff, will control cats and foxes a bit, but wouldn't work here.
Yeah, I've read stuff about that recently about dingo packs establishing like an alpha predator substance sort of thing. But again, they mentioned that with sheep you get way too many losses for it to be worth it, whereas with cattle it's manageable, I guess. But yeah, it would be.
I'll still get the odd calf, but sheep are a lot more vulnerable.
Yeah.
We get the odd wild dog, but no dingoes.
Is there a lot of government support for this kind of regenerative ag process, like incentives for those more conservative farmers to take up?
There has been a bit for some of the education courses, and occasionally you can buy some native plants or subsidise them. But it's still a challenging paradigm against the dominant industrial. But I think it's shifting.
Is it shifting quickly enough, do you think? Or
Look, I don't know if you guys have read any of Paul Hawkins' work, Drawdown and all that sort of stuff. He's a friend of mine. I've got to know him in the last few years, and he says we've only got 25 years. If we don't turn climate around by then, we're stuck. The way it's accelerating. He's right. So, and when we got, without getting political, but right-wing, anal-gazing governments, we're not going to get the solution. I mean, you'd think that the greatest challenge the Earth and humanity's ever faced might be top of the agenda. They'll act when it's too late. So, but there are good things happening in the landscape, and barrier reef now, and big programs there that's really starting to address some of those issues. It's up to the individuals. So, human ecology is a great start. You better not repeat some of this stuff.
I want to talk a little bit beyond the farm gate. What, for example, is your capacity to connect to, say, consumers? What role do you see established food distribution systems, Coles, Woolworths, of course, in Australia, that 60% of what we produce is exported overseas and not even consumed by Australian consumers anyway?
Yeah, really good question. Because we grow beautiful fine wool that goes into Italy. We don't use any herbicides. Well, the only herbicides for serrated tussocks is organic. We don't use any fertilisers anymore. Just rely on natural functions. think, yeah, at some stage we've got to completely redesign our supply chains away from export. I mean, with wool it's understandable, but it's no reason why Australia. I'll put it this way, I've been involved in trying to pioneer local wool processing of elite fibres, and it's a hard road to follow and you lose a lot of money doing it. But maybe one day that'll shift to local processing and local food distribution. But there's no doubt that there's an increasing demand for healthy fibre and food off regenerative landscapes, and we've got to refocus, I think, to a lot more to our local economy, short food miles, and healthy, nutrient-dense foods, because the savings on the health bill. I mean, look at it this way. From the leading researchers I've looked at, by about 2040, the cancers, some of the ADHDs, and obesity, and a few of those is going to kill any modern economy. They're just doing that as we strip the nutrients out of our food, and glyphosate gets in and affects us. I mean, glyphosate gets into the gut, penetrates the gut lining, and we now know it gets into the brain, gets into placental, crosses the placental lining, and that sort of stuff. Those sorts of disease impositions, from obesity and the cancers, and all those other modern diseases, that they've only done that about a decade behind the rise of industrial chemicals for agriculture. It's going to kill any modern economy. So that the more we can shift to more regional and local food economies, the better.
Do you think the pandemic's a good stimulant for that process?
I think it's going to make people rethink, don't you? Yeah, and hopefully you're going to Woolies. Most of that stuff, despite the bullshit about being organic, because I know some of the organic suppliers, it's not organic. Most of that stuff is nutrient empty, which has huge disease implications. The rest of it's packaged shit designed to sit on a shelf for a year. It's only irreparably harming our health. If we can shift just the food we consume, the impact on the national economy is going to be enormous. And you know, my daughter's been working in that space in Melbourne, pretty vibrant local food economies, and it's growing, but trouble for Australia, we're a small population and big farming landscape. We can't all go local. I don't know, what else did you want to address?
Well, that question, I think, is to the point about whether you think that COVID-19 might have, in some sense, cracked that collective carapace that you talked about.
Cracker, you'd hope. Yeah,
I mean, just this is something that made me think of, like the Buy from the Bush campaign that kind of came out of the fires. I think also, like, that pervaded my consciousness a lot more. So I wonder if movements like that are growing, given the current situation as well.
you know, I'm not that ancient, a bit ancient, but I grew up in the 50s, and especially here, you know, we weren't even a remote district, totally self-sufficient with food, nutrient-rich food. We're only harvesting yesterday some of our 1850s mulberries. I mean, it tastes totally different to the modern food. And it's not that hard to, you know, grow your veggies, or at least some of them. But to get back to the Woolies and Coles, I mean, most of those foods are only going to do harm. So they're stripped of their phytochemicals and nutrients. So support your local organic shops and grow your own. It's hugely important. You know, and a lot of the modern breeds of fruit, you know, you taste a modern mulberry, it's tasteless compared to those 1840s things there, and explode in your mouth. I mean, I don't know how much time you got, whether we go down to look at a creek we're renovating or grab a mulberry. There's a few just left. It's totally different food.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's go mulberry. mulberry picking. Yeah.
There's not many left, but you'd get one each to taste it. It's a different food. Did you want to look at just some creek renovation we're doing, Rob, or you're happy with?
We've got no other people stops. We can stop at Jindabyne Dam Wall and talk about water storage and diversion, but you were the last person to disappoint by being late today. We completed that sheet.
No, I was on a Zoom lecture to a couple of hundred signers, so I was late too, so I was glad to get out of that.
This involves driving.
Yeah, it's a good road,
Yep.
a reasonable road, shouldn't do too many sumps.
No more than
I can show you what we're doing with creek work as far as, it's like Andrew's, it's modified Andrew's leaky weir stuff, and you'll see some of the paddocks down there where we've kept sort of native diversity with judicious grazing and stuff, and then we can see how many mulberries are left when we come back, if you like.
Sounds great.
Yep.
Does that cover pretty much this landscape?
Pretty good. I got a question about working with traditional owners and farms and stuff, but we can have that discussion down there maybe.
We try and run a field day every year with guy who's become a friend. He's a senior in Garrigo Elder, Rod Mason. He's got his own Indigenous name, which he keeps quiet, but he's a senior lawman, one of the senior guys in Australia. And we usually do a workshop every year of traditional burning.
So you know Millpost? Do you know Millpost? Yeah. So you probably know they've got the Aboriginal site listed now that Dave Johnson found, the axe quarry up there.
Yeah.
And we talked to them a little bit. I was sort of involved with that project and with the archaeology, but it's kind of this discussion that I'm interested in having with farmers about bringing the state onto property in terms of, they've set up it's an Aboriginal place, and that has to come through OEH, which is attached to New South Wales government and heritage, their environment. So, I mean, if that were the case, you mentioned, the embarrassment of having TOs on the property when you own it and sort of managing that dynamic. Would you see that as a potential option for, opening up part of the property and having mob come on to it to be able to use it?
Well, we're doing that with the Yuin women. They can have as much land, obviously not grazing land because it's not going to work for the Yandays, but we've got a lot of area in tree breaks with the perfect soil for the Yandays. And the only thing we're offering is the land. We don't want any money for it, we just developed a relationship.
And that's so important. I mean, that's what we're seeing around the country, that we need the space to do that, and Bruce is working with the UN Food stuff as well.
Exactly.
And my uncle Noel in down around Kiola, they're doing that same work. But that's the thing, it's hard to get onto the property in the first place, I think. So, I mean, you're obviously really receptive to something like that, but would you see that translate to these other properties around, or do you think they would have a harder border?
Very conservative area. I mean, I grew up in the Monero not seeing an Aboriginal. It wasn't until I went to uni that, and then became friends with some, and then went from there. But it'd be challenging. But I mean, we don't know where it's going. We're working with a large philanthropy group. What we're hoping to do, and Rod, we wanted him involved, but he's actually, on his mother's side, it was his ancestor at the age of 14 who met Captain Cook when he landed. So Rod's been involved in all that City 250 year stuff.
The Guigle Shield stuff.
Yeah, all that. And there's a lot of fights over who's doing all that usual stuff, of course. But we're working with Rod in other areas. Anyway, we put this proposal to a big philanthropy group to buy up about 15,000 acres around here to reclaim the country, but with major Indigenous ownership and involvement. And it's fallen through for the time being. So that'd be one way. I mean, wouldn't make us very popular, but we'd regenerate grasslands, and we'd have cultural burning done properly, and yam days is another bush tucker and things. But this is not an easy district to do that.
I have a question on that. The first property we went to, they were speaking about how important community is in terms of collaboration and stuff. So it sounds like you're polar opposites in terms of approaches to land management and stuff. So how do you feel about that, having less of a connection with your neighbours?
Oh, look, I get on with them, but we've done radical things in sheep breeding and land management, and so we don't discuss it. It is a very conservative district. There's not many, out of 1,000 there's about 8 regen farmers. Some districts you'll find 20-30% adoption. It's just the cultural background, and don't know what else it is. So you can't fight that. You just
talk about it.
see what's happened now with things like regen ag. You'll feel that there's what's called a community of practice, which is outside district. It's across not just Australia but internationally. You're communicating on these common issues of regen ag with a huge community, which occasionally you might meet. A lot of it's online, and there's wonderful conferences. When before COVID came, you could go to anywhere in the world. I used to speak in America and South Africa and places, but so you have a community of practice outside your actual physical community, and that's how you get around that. I mean, you must know that. Indigenous people.
Do you guys do much burning or anything like that? Like you just mentioned
No.
burning.
We run this burning workshop with Rod, and I'm still in kindergarten, learning how to use it as a tool. But it's a really powerful tool to get some native grass going and put carbon in the soil. A lot of it's about getting the right carbon back in.
Is there any kangaroo grass growing around here?
Not here, because it used to be a sheep camp and it was flogged. But I can show you some, when we come back from the mulberries, I can show you where some paddocks where it's really starting to come. It's lovely stuff.
Made the mulberries once, so better follow through.
Have to follow through. Let's hope we find some. I've got grandchildren that rate it.